I just think it was really interesting to see Hayes be presented with this different approach by Argentina and saying, okay, instead of kind of ramming it through the middle or relegating to long ball or trying to do like crosses in the air, like as we know, all of these sort of like low variable, low efficiency ideas that sometimes the US can get relegated to against playing a 5-back. She's like, okay, no, we're going to cut in. We're going to find these spaces in between the lines. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Thursday, October 31st. Happy Halloween, everybody. We're wrapping up the U.S. Women's National Team international window after they've played their third game of the window. We have an NWSL preview for what's going to be a very exciting final regular season weekend for the NWSL as they move into the postseason. There's a lot to dig into, a little bit of game analysis, a little bit of news, and a little bit of some goodbyes to some of the teams that we enjoyed this summer. Let's dig in. All right, so we first are going to discuss the third game in the U.S. Women's National Team's international break over October. 3 games, which it's like unclear why there were 3 games. I think there were a lot of different like theories about that, but as it stands, 3 games for the US for some particular reason. And I think as people probably expect in that kind of a situation, there was a heavy emphasis on rotation. I think at some point a manager like Emma Hayes is just trying to make sure that the team gets out okay, that no one gets hurt, understanding that not only is much of the team going back to NWSL regular season and postseason, but immediately after that postseason, the US is heading to Europe to play England and the Netherlands. So it is nonstop for these U.S. Women's National Team, NWSL, or even WSL players where they're just going back to their clubs. They're going to be playing throughout the month of November, and then they are heading to a very big, important window, which I think we're going to take a little bit differently as the coaching staff will. But they do win this third game 3-0 against Argentina. As people might know, again, the 2 games against Iceland and then 1 game against Argentina to close this out in Louisville. Naomi Girma is the star center back extraordinaire. Naomi Girma scores her first 2 international goals and heavily influences a third, which was an own goal. I'm going to start with kind of an encapsulation of the window by Emma Hayes, is what she said in post-game, and then kind of break down what I thought happened in this third game, because like I said, we did see a lot of rotation. We saw players get new caps. We saw players look in different positions. We saw a whole new landscape of what this player pool looks like. Again, forced by fitness, but not a bad time to try it anyway. And I like that Hayes did. So here's what Hayes says. She's talking about the entire window. She says 3 different wins. Talking about this game about Argentina, she says today it's a 5-back. The types of goals you score are pretty normal, or the types of goals you scored are pretty normal in this type of game. And then she says to clawing our way back from a 1-0 game against Iceland the other night. The first 2 games, there were really strong finishes to the game. So seeing different sides of us and obviously seeing more players, which I really, really wanted, end quote. I think that's pretty much it, right? Like, I really like the way Hayes has handled this window. I've said many times that it's a different challenge than winning the Olympics. It's a different challenge than honing an Olympic roster in that window right before the big international tournament. This is a very different job, but it is the job that she was ultimately hired to do. And it seems like she has a lot of really good ideas on how to do it. I really like how much she's respected players' club duties and what that means for their fitness. That is a healthy look at the player pool. It means that she's going to have healthy relationships with club coaches, hopefully, when maybe in the future clubs have more of a say in whether they release players for some of these things, not during the breaks. But as we know, sometimes the U.S. has to play games outside of international breaks. She had said before this game that no player with a Friday NWSL game would play in the Wednesday game against Argentina. That ended up being mostly true. She had Mandy Hott of Utah play in goal against Argentina. Hott does play on Friday, but as you might imagine for a goalkeeper, it's a little bit of a different ask than what it would be for an outfield player. And also, she did say this was going to happen. Rose Lavelle played for a half to celebrate her 100 caps. Shout out to Rose Lavelle's dog, Wilma Jean Wrinkles, for being there in Louisville and celebrating 100 caps. Rose Lavelle is one of one, and her 100 cap celebration was one of one. And you could see not only kind of what that means for like who Rose Lavelle is, but it almost helps her teammates celebrate her in her own special way. You saw Emily Sonnet chopping it up with the dog, just really, really cute to open the game. And so with that heavy rotation, you saw a lot of new players. We're going to run down the starting 11 and talk about what exactly we saw both positionally and in terms of new faces. So like I said, Mandy Hott of Utah, who was brought into the goalkeeping camp because of an injury to Jane Campbell. She gets her first U.S. Women's National Team start. Haley Mace, Naomi Girma, Eva Gaetino, and Alyssa Melanson, they are going to round out the back line. Hal Hirschfeld, Rose Lavelle, and Lindsay Horan are the midfield. And then Emma Sears, Jaden Shaw, and Ashley Sanchez were that front three. Gattino, Hott, and Mallinson earned their first caps. That joins Hal Hirschfeld, Yasmin Ryan, Emily Sams, and Emma Sears in this window. So that's 7 different players earning their first cap over 3 matches in October, which is the most in one international window since 2001. The way I am interpreting that is 2 ways. One is that I think with the choice of locations for these games and the choice of opponents for these games, there was a comfort level in rotation from the United States that I think was very good. I also think, frankly, just the fact that there were 3 games in this window forced Hayes into kind of emptying the roster, emptying the bench in a way that maybe she wouldn't otherwise. She's said, frankly, she's not going to do that in these big games against England and the Netherlands, where it's a very different kind of challenge, different task for the coaching squad. And Argentina is even a very different opponent than Iceland. This is something that I thought Julie Foudy did a nice job on the broadcast on Wednesday, highlighting. This colors all analysis of this game, because you don't want to say, the U.S. did this well or Argentina did this poorly without understanding the larger context. Argentina is a team that is underfunded and overlooked by their federation. This is a team that over a course of years have alienated their stars. They had a lot of very green players on this roster. So even this Argentina team was less experienced than other Argentina teams. And also it was their first game together since July. So not only were these players inexperienced, but this team just has not gotten the consistent play that the United States has gotten. They do not get the resources that the United States gets. That is important when analyzing this, even from the soccer side, because we're going to talk about things like set piece defending. We're going to talk about things like a 5-back or a very conservative approach against a team like the United States. And it all is affected by the context around the game. Argentina comes out in a 5-back. They're parking the bus. There almost is no bus. There's no wheels on the bus. They're not moving. The bus is parked. They're parked in a 5-back. They're basically asking the United States to move the ball, to do one-touch football, to get around sort of that stacked 5-back and relegate the U.S. to low-quality chances with the hopes of keeping this score line reasonable, which they did. I would say in many ways, if you think of the job being, again, if the job is as conservative as Argentina played it, job done. 3-0, not bad. I thought where Hayes put some of these players was interesting. It wasn't just that some of the players were new. It was how she kind of fit them all onto the field. You saw Jaden Shaw playing the number 9 again, which she did for not an entire game, but for some of the game on Sunday against Iceland. You saw Ashley Sanchez come in at left wing. Sears was at right wing. You had Melanson at left back, Mace at right back. You had Hal Hirschfeld at the number 6. So you're seeing these players fit in, which we're going to talk about how Hayes asked them to play. But I think looking at Sanchez going into left wing, this is something that Hayes, I don't think this is unique to Ashley Sanchez. Hayes has asked a number of playmaking number 10s to figure out how to utilize the left wing to their advantage in that way. We've seen it happen with Jaden Shaw. People might recall Rose Lavelle was kind of figuring out how to duck in from that left wing position prior to the Olympics. This is a common place to stash a really talented attacking player if you have somebody else that you want playing the actual number 10. In this case, it was Rose Lavelle. You saw that 4-3-3 again in possession, with the wings being very involved. I liked that. I still think, again, tiny tweaks. I think we saw a very traditional 4-3-3 in that there was a desire to see overlapping runs from the outside backs and your wingers. You had Sears and Mace working really well together on the right side, where you had Sears utilizing width and getting to the end line, and you had Mace tucking in, which is something she's very comfortable with in Kansas City. On the other side, Sanchez looked a little bit less comfortable doing the same thing. In fact, Hayes said after the game that she thought that Sanchez could have started tucking in a little bit earlier. You saw Sanchez being the player that wanted to stay out wide, and then you had Melanson tucking in. They probably would have been better served switching that, having Sanchez come into the half spaces rather than having Melanson come into the half spaces. I did like, however, that those two got a whole game to figure out exactly what they were doing on that left side. And as people might recall, that third goal that Naomi Girma scores to put the scoreline at 3-0 was utilized or was created by Melanson and Sanchez kind of finding that rhythm for the first time. I thought maybe we were going to see, excess width. I thought maybe we were going to see some of those numbers forward the same way that we saw in the Iceland games. But instead, it seemed like Hayes was really interested in those half spaces. And I think that those half spaces are important when you are playing a team as compact as Argentina was trying to play. And I do think, again, like that ball progression is a little bit different than it was in the first two games. I think you weren't seeing, again, the central midfield being used as much. I was curious, actually, if Sanchez was going to tuck into the number 10 after Lavelle came off. That isn't ultimately what happened. You had Corbin Albert come on. But yeah, I just think it was really interesting to see Hayes be presented with this different approach by Argentina and saying, okay, instead of kind of ramming it through the middle or relegating to long ball or trying to do like crosses in the air. Like, as we know, all of these sort of like low variable, low efficiency ideas that sometimes the US can get relegated to against playing a 5-back. She's like, okay, no, we're going to cut in. We're going to find these spaces in between the lines. And I think a lot of times you saw the US playing a lot of one-touch football. You saw a lot of just, give and go between a player like Shaw, who I actually think did a nice job getting more involved after struggling, I think, to get as involved against Iceland on Sunday. Again, you saw that nice movement between Mace and Sears on the right side. You saw Sanchez and Mallinson grow into the game. Now, all of this is great, and I thought that the U.S. had a very comfortable first half, and there was no real danger of anything going the other way, or I even thought they did a nice job. You saw some really nice piercing passes from that central midfield to try to open things up. Like, I think the ideas were there. The final execution in front of goal wasn't quite, but enter in Naomi Girma. Naomi Girma, fearsome attacker, fearsome with her head. Everyone says this. Everyone says that she's the tallest player on the pitch at a mighty 5'7", and everybody knows that she's the target on set pieces. I'm just kidding. But you could see, just in terms of how beloved she is and maybe how unexpected this was, how happy her teammates were for this sort of goal-scoring explosion. After the game, Sophia Smith welcomes her as a new member of the Triple Espresso in the post-game mix zone. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I think a lot of people have already, and I think they're doing a nice job explaining it. But a lot has been said about the Ballon d'Or this week. That's an award that frankly doesn't really mean that much to me on the women's side, as the fact that the Ballon d'Or hasn't really invested in making the women's part of the competition as prestigious as the men's side. And also, just as an American, I'm a little bit like, it's great. It's French. Everyone puts on big clothes and goes and gets an award. And I say this despite thinking that many deserving players have won it, especially on the women's side. It's not discounting that. I think many deserving players have won those awards, but there is some kind of like narrative catharsis to Girma scoring the same week she was snubbed from, or it was actually, just noticeable that she was snubbed from the short list for the Ballon d'Or. But there's obviously another good data point at play other than, Girma going God mode and influencing 3 goals and scoring 2 and becoming the first U.S. center back to score since like the 90s, or score 2 goals since the 90s, which is that the U.S. finally punched a few goals in on set pieces. I talked about this earlier this week about that second game against Iceland, where you want one of two things, right? You want either for the set piece differential to be in the positives, or you want the team to figure things out in open play. Against Iceland, they did not punch things in on set pieces, but they did figure it out in open play. Against Argentina, it was the opposite. They were able to finally get either that first wave or second wave off of corners, off of free kicks, to get their center backs involved and utilize their numbers to punch it into goal. Much has been made about the U.S. losing some of its edge on set pieces. I think set pieces are such an interesting tool for an international team. If you rely on them too much, you get criticized for one-way football. If you don't have them in your arsenal, you get accused of not being able to win international tournaments where those kinds of margins can make the difference. With everything that I said about Argentina and sort of how they approached this game and how the Federation approaches this team, some of the marking on these set pieces were not necessarily there. So yes, maybe a little bit easier for the United States to get something out of it, but I do think it is probably nice. And again, you see the relief for them that they did, and that it was one of their favorite players who got it done. It just was good vibes to end this window where, again, this game could have just been, it could have been useless. This game could have been absolutely nothing. It could have turned into a track meet. It could have been slow paced. You could have, just seen players out of ideas. You did see some like a quote unquote sort of effort stats be a little bit low for the United States, because I do think that players were thinking about their fitness as instructed by the coaching staff. You didn't see a lot of players take on dribbles. It was a lot of, again, short passing, slow, trying to find the right penetrating pass, trying to find the right goal. But then you punch it in on a set piece and the game state changes, and then suddenly you can save your legs and you can be like, okay, we are executing this the way that we want to. We are getting the goals that we need. And also we don't have to kill ourselves to do it, which is great, because I just think you can't take this particular game state out of the fact that it was this third game and players have to think about their legs. Other positives. So let's talk big picture a little bit. I thought the game was good. Again, I've said this throughout this whole window. There's no real bad result in terms of the game of the team's progression. I'm very, very happy that everyone made it out without injury. I hope actually Jane Campbell is doing well. She's the one player who I think suffered something in training. But all three keepers in camp got starts. Hayes very committed to rotation. We don't see that a lot. And we know that the goalkeeping pool is one that you might actually argue is the least healthy, just because they've really struggled to get a consistent backup to Nair, and they tend to hold on to goalkeepers for a very long time. I like how, again, respectful Hayes has been of club commitments, not just in the NWSL, but elsewhere. And she says she's been in communication with the club coaches, and that being a healthy relationship, I think, is really important. And even if things didn't always look perfect, the team always looked coherent in all three games. There is something to heavy rotation and seeing brand new players get onto the pitch and nobody lost their head, right? I think I liked, maybe a good example is I liked Hal Hirschfeld as a DM in this game against Argentina. I think that is worth exploring further. That's not a very deep position at the moment for the United States. And you like that progression of Hirschfeld getting called in as an alternate for the Olympics. She doesn't get onto a roster just through circumstance, but she does get called back in. She gets her first cap, gets her first start, and she looks confident. I thought she did a really nice job of finding the line of contention where it needed to be against Argentina. I think maybe you saw a little bit of some steps being off because she was getting her feet underneath her, but nothing egregious. I think Hirschfeld is a really interesting option for that number 6 role that, as we've seen Sam Coffey step into, but there is room for more players in the mix there, especially because I just don't think Corbin Albert, when she's holding, is as effective. I think she's more effective going forward. Thought all of the new center backs did themselves very proud. I would not be surprised if we didn't see Emily Sams in particular as a big part of the player pool going forward. I think that the fact that she subbed into this game and was able to make that rotation, which is difficult to do sometimes to rotate in center backs. We did get Girma and Sams for a little bit, which, again, a good sign. I think if a coach is slotting you in next to Naomi Girma, that's a really good sign of where she thinks you might be able to help the team. Gaetino also did a nice job in her limited minutes. Thought Emma Sears as a true winger, that she was able to really shine in both of these games. It felt like she was actually the player most likely to get on the dribble in this game against Argentina. There was no Alyssa Thompson in this third game, but I think similarly in this window, having that really healthy addition to the winger pool is very important, especially because I thought Lynn Williams had a very good camp as a number 9. We saw Williams come in a central role in that second game against Iceland and be very effective. And this is something that I've been talking about. Gosh, I was talking about this like over and over and over again at the beginning of this year about how Lynn Williams quietly has added so much to her tool set in terms of being able to, yes, play backup roles from the winger position, but she also is a quality number 9 now. She's high efficiency at the club level, at least. And I just think that having her in that role, testing Shaw in that role, who's, like I said, I think did a nice job in the second game that she got as the number 9. I like that. Again, it's healthy. What happens when you don't have Sophia Smith available? What happens when you don't have that triple espresso, right? So again, very productive window overall. And then a few true tests coming up in Europe against England, who has had kind of an interesting international window. They didn't look great. I think they're in a different part of their cycle. I think any European competition, especially teams like England and the Netherlands, and we'll get into this once we get a little bit closer to it, but the US is very out of sync with some of these European teams who have a major tournament in less than a year, right? So what they are doing right now feels akin to what the US was doing in the Gold Cup, which is that like maybe you sink, like it's a sink or swim situation and you're testing veterans out and maybe it doesn't go super well, so you have to make changes. They're just in sort of this different rotation. I wouldn't overthink it, but I do think that they are going to have a blast out there. And I think that the US might be able to bring a little bit of competition to both of these games because they've looked pretty good and they've looked pretty steady. And like there are a lot of different players who can step in and do a nice job. And then real quick, we're going to turn our attention back to the United States domestic soccer. The NWSL is back for a final regular season weekend this weekend. Kind of an interesting schedule where you get the regular season mostly done, then the international break, then final regular season weekend, and then into the postseason. We're going to have a lot of really nice storylines this weekend. Major ones, I think you've got 3 teams fighting for 2 playoff spots in Portland, Louisville, and Bay FC. I think you've got another really big goodbye, passing of the torch in Portland, Christine Sinclair's final regular season game in Portland. Really incredible end to a very incredible career. I'm very interested to see kind of how that team handles the emotions of that big moment while also needing to get a result to own their own destiny going into the postseason. We're going to be saying goodbyes to one of those 3 teams, but also certainly to Utah, Angel City, Seattle, Houston, and San Diego. And so real quick, before we go, I want to do some final farewells to some of these teams that we will be saying goodbye to, because it is going to be all speed ahead for the playoffs after this weekend. So Utah, after a nice turnaround in the second half of this season, has hired interim manager Jimmy Cohen-Rates full-time. And I do think they should keep leaning into their young stars and the fast-paced style of play that turned their season around. Don't overthink it. Keep the momentum going. Stabilize. Stay young. They've got some good young players. They've got some nice signings from the midseason. Keep building, and I think that they could be in playoff contention next year. Angel City, I think that team needs a style of play identity, which is not necessarily so focused on the roster anymore. I think they have the pieces of roster construction to be a playoff contender, but how do you elevate that into a tactical game plan that those players can execute? That is what I feel like I didn't totally see from Angel City this year, especially in the second half of the season. Seattle needs a bigger rethink. I think in retrospect, we can say that the final hurrah of the OGs was clearly last year. Everyone knew Megan Rapinoe was leaving, but it does just feel like that chapter of the team has clearly ended after the way this season has gone. So who does the Reign want to be without the OGs? And is the real OG, Laura Harvey, what is her vision for the future in a team that is really, really changing? And what can she put together as a compelling manager of a compelling team after those deep relationships that she had with those original members of the Reign? And then for Houston and San Diego, I'm going to glom them together a little bit. I think they both need to just decide that they're serious, which going into this season, I don't think anyone would have anticipated saying that about both Houston and San Diego. Houston struggling every single year to make it above the playoff line. San Diego, last year's NWSL Shield winners, right? But the coaching and GM situation in Houston, with the players none the wiser, kind of asking desperately to figure out who their interim manager was going to be or what was going on with Fran Alonso when he was out of market, or, you know, the quiet absence of their general manager. It just seems like Houston, there's no answers. They don't have a good structure in that front office. And you just worry that the cycle is going to continue for the Houston Dash. And then for San Diego, you know, we talked about this timeline a couple weeks ago of just sort of how everything has gone sort of horribly wrong for the San Diego Wave. But at this moment, you know, they're knee deep in litigation from former employees with an embattled club president and no coach. They have a GM that they hired just this season. It's really interesting to see like what empowerment she's been given to change the roster. And the players of these two teams are too talented for this, right? And under a new CBA, keeping up isn't going to get any easier. It's going to be harder and harder to keep up with the teams that are doing things right. You got to fix it or lose what you got. And maybe a team like San Diego in particular, we were just talking about Naomi Girma, right? How do you keep Naomi Girma happy is like the first order of business for this team going into the offseason. And I think it's a taller order than maybe they were anticipating going into this year. For the playoff teams, Portland plays first on Friday. They can clinch with a result or some help. Bay plays on Saturday. They can clinch next with a result or some help. And then by Sunday, Louisville will know if they have a shot or not by the time they play. So no decision day this year. I love decision day. I miss it. But with the rolling TV schedules, you're always going to have some struggle with that because, as we know, we have certain days for certain networks in the NWSL now. And so in order to lay all of that out, you're not going to have a decision day. But I do kind of like the 1-1-1, like, what if Portland doesn't? What if Portland does take a loss? What if Bay FC gets sniped by Houston, right? Like, we have that drama going into Sunday, I hope. But if not, you know, it's been a great season. I would love to see it go down to the wire. But also, I think the order works out in that you've got the team who needs a result, team who needs a result, and then the team who needed some help. And we'll find out either way. And then for everybody else, you just got to stay healthy. I think every other team that's moving into playoffs, been a weird kind of layoff. I hope the teams have been well rested. I hope that they've been able to train and hone some things. Really kind of bad trajectory right now for Chicago, who will be without Kisang Lumila for the next 3 games, which is that regular season finale, the quarterfinal, and either the semi or next year's opener due to that scuffle against the Spirit prior to the international break. Her red card was extended additional games. Disaster for the Red Stars. She's been so important to their offense when it's been working, but even they have just really been struggling to close out the regular season. Chicago just doesn't have the momentum that they need right now when they're going to be asked to do a very difficult thing on the road in the postseason. And then on the Spirit side, Rosamond Kwasi has been issued an additional 1-match suspension, so she will miss the quarterfinal in addition to their regular season finale. Washington, you just worry about the injuries. Really, really hope that Trinity Rodman is feeling better, because otherwise it might be chalk, and we don't like chalk in the NWSL. That's the anti-chaos mode. So I can't wait to see what happens this weekend. I mostly just hope that these playoff teams get through intact. I hope we have some satisfying endings for the playoff contenders. And then I hope that fans of the teams that are bowing out have glimpses of something to be excited about, because it's going to be a long off season with a lot of change. No draft, right? Crazy. And so we're just going to have to see what happens next. So I'm very excited to see how the NWSL postseason shakes out. It's always the best time of year. So this has been today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. We'll have more NWSL for you next week. We're going to keep checking in on the WNBA offseason. And can you believe it? College basketball starts next week. Next week, we're going to hit some of the big storylines of the college basketball season in a big preview at the beginning of next week. Everyone, stay tuned. We keep rolling. New stuff, chill in the air. Can't wait to talk about it.